You think the bottom of the ocean has been explored. After all, we have submarines and satellites and photographs of nearly every corner of the world. But here is something almost nobody talks about. The deepest place on this planet, the very bottom of the Mariana Trench, has been visited by fewer human beings than have walked on the surface of the moon. On the morning of January 23, 1960, two men climbed into a cramped steel sphere bolted underneath a giant tank of gasoline. The machine was called the Trieste. The men were a Swiss scientist named Jacques Picard and a young American Navy officer named Don Walsh. And over the next 5 hours, they did something no person had ever done. They fell almost 7 miles straight down into the deepest crack in the earth, all the way to the bottom. And then we just stopped. So how is it that more than 60 years later, with all of our technology and all of our wealth, we have mapped the surface of Mars in finer detail than the floor of our own ocean? Why did we turn around at the single greatest moment of deep-sea exploration and simply walk away? The answer is not really about the ocean at all. It is about us, and about a choice an entire generation quietly made. Let me show you what happened. The strange part is that the very thing that made that 1960 dive possible was also the thing that doomed it. To understand why, you have to understand the machine. The Trieste was not a submarine in any normal sense. It was the underwater cousin of a balloon. It was designed by a Swiss inventor named Auguste Picard, who happened to be the father of one of the two men climbing inside it. And the Picard family had a habit of going to extremes. Years earlier, Auguste had set world records flying balloons higher into the sky than anyone before him. Now his son was about to carry the family name in the exact opposite direction, deeper than any human had ever gone. One family, the highest place a person had ever reached, and soon the lowest. But a machine like this was almost impossible to build, and even harder to repeat. There were only two of these strange vessels in the entire world. The United States Navy had purchased the Trieste in 1958, hoping it could reach depths no other craft could survive. When the time came to find someone to pilot it, almost nobody volunteered. As Don Walsh later explained, there were no spare parts and no instruction manual, because there was no one else on Earth doing this. He and his crewmates had to invent everything as they went. It was a one-of-a-kind triumph with no future built into it, and that small detail is going to matter more than anything else in this story. Walsh very nearly did not get the job, and he was the first to admit why. He liked to joke that he had been on the junior varsity squad of the Navy. His ranking coming out of the Naval Academy had been so low that, as he told it, he had been informed he was officially stupid. So when the Navy asked for volunteers to ride a steel ball to the bottom of the sea, he raised his hand, mostly because it sounded like an adventure. The head of the Navy made him a quiet promise. If the dive succeeded, the Navy would celebrate it loudly. If it failed, the Navy would never speak of it again. Which, looking back, was either an act of tremendous confidence or a polite way of preparing for a funeral. The descent itself was slow and dark and strangely beautiful. As the Trieste sank, the two men peered through a tiny window and watched glowing creatures stream upward past them like an upside-down snowstorm, little sparks of living light in water that had never seen the sun. Down they went, past 1 mile, then 2, then 3. And then, at about 30,000 feet, it happened. A loud crack rang through the cabin, like an explosion going off right beside them. The whole vessel shuddered. The two men looked at each other and said nothing. They had no way of knowing what had broken, but they reasoned that if the damage were truly serious, the pressure outside would already have crushed them both in an instant. So they kept going. When they finally touched the bottom, the landing kicked up a thick cloud of fine silt, and the water turned into something Walsh compared to a bowl of milk. They had reached the deepest point on Earth, and they could barely see out the window. They stayed for about 20 minutes. Picard believed he spotted a flat fish lying on the seabed, though scientists today doubt that anything with a backbone could survive that pressure, and whatever he saw was probably something far stranger. Then the two men released their weights and began the long climb back toward the light. They had done it. They had proven that a human being could reach the bottom of the world and return alive. But most people never heard the part that came next, or rather, the part that did not come next. That crack they had heard was one of the windows fractured by the pressure. The mission carried no real cameras and collected no samples. The entire purpose of the dive had been almost painfully simple. Touch the bottom, prove it could be reached, and come home. And in that narrow goal, it succeeded completely. But it meant the two men returned with almost nothing a scientist could actually study. They had no usable photographs of the seabed and nothing a biologist could place under a microscope. All they carried home was a story, a depth reading, and a cracked pane of plastic. And here is where the clock started ticking without anyone hearing it. A second expedition was supposed to follow. It never came. The Trieste was enormously expensive to operate. It could not take pictures. It could not gather samples. For all its glory, it had very little to show. And so the most ambitious dive in human history was quietly set aside. Don Walsh carried this with him for the rest of his life. Looking back, decades later, he said something that has always stuck with me. He admitted he had always been disappointed that no one returned to that spot just a couple of months after their dive. Because if someone had, he said, it would have meant the deep trenches genuinely mattered to the people who study the ocean. Instead, the silence stretched on for years and then for decades. This is the moment the real answer begins to come into focus. The ocean had not actually defeated us. The pressure was brutal and the darkness was total, and yes, the deep sea is one of the most hostile places a human can possibly go. You will hear people say that this hostility is the reason we stopped, that the ocean simply pushed us out and refused to let us return. But that explanation does not quite hold up. We had just proven that the machines could be built and the pressure survived. What was missing was something simpler. It was the will to go back. And at the precise moment the deep ocean needed champions, the entire world had begun to look up instead of down. Pay attention to this next part, because it is the clearest sign of just how completely the deep was forgotten. After Piccard and Walsh climbed out of the Trieste in 1960, the bottom of the Mariana Trench sat untouched by human beings for 52 years. Sit with that number for a moment, more than half a century. For almost all of that time, exactly 2 people in the history of the species had ever stood at the deepest point on the planet, and both of them had done it on the very same afternoon. The next person to reach the bottom did not arrive until 2012, and it was not who you might expect. It was a Hollywood film director. James Cameron, the man behind Titanic and Avatar, climbed into a lime green submersible he had largely paid for out of his own pocket and dropped completely alone to the bottom of the world. He became only the 3rd human ever to make the journey. Afterward, he carried his little submarine all the way to the United States Congress and sat in front of lawmakers, very nearly pleading with them to take the ocean seriously again. The deepest place on Earth had become the passion project of a movie maker because the people who were supposed to care had simply stopped paying attention. So how does that happen? How does the greatest unexplored frontier on our own planet, a place we had already conquered once, simply slip off the map of human ambition? It is not as though we had lost our hunger to explore. The 1960s were one of the most adventurous decades in all of human history. Engineers were building machines no one had ever dreamed of. Ordinary families gathered around television sets to watch explorers risk their lives. Money poured into research like water from a tap. The appetite for discovery was enormous. It just all pointed in a single direction, and it was not down. To see where it went, you have to picture the world these 2 men came home to. The Cold War was at its peak. 2 superpowers were locked in a contest for the future, and that contest had found itself a brand new arena, not the ocean, the sky. And nearly everything, the budgets, the brilliant young minds, the dreams of an entire generation of children, was about to be aimed at a single glowing target roughly 3 days away. If you are enjoying this journey into the deep, take a second to subscribe. Every week I dig into the stories of our own planet that most people walk straight past, the kind of history that hides in plain sight. Now let me show you exactly where the world turned its eyes. While the Trieste was being quietly mothballed, something else was capturing the imagination of the entire world. In 1958, just 2 years before that record dive, the United States had created a brand new agency with a single thrilling purpose. Its name was NASA, and its eyes were fixed firmly on the heavens. And the timing of it all was almost too perfect. The same handful of years that the Navy spent buying a submarine to go down, the nation spent building an agency to go up. Then in 1961, a young president stood before Congress and made one promise that changed everything. America would land a man on the moon and bring him safely home before the decade was over. The whole country leaned in, and the money followed in a way that is almost hard to believe today. By the middle of the 1960s, the space program was swallowing roughly 4 cents out of every single dollar the entire federal government spent. The Apollo program alone consumed more than half of NASA's enormous budget. That is the kind of spending that makes accountants weep. There is a small detail here that captures the whole mood of the age. Jacques Picard, the same man who had ridden the Trieste to the bottom of the world, built one more vessel, an underwater craft designed to drift inside the Gulf Stream for weeks at a time. It slipped beneath the surface on the 14th of July, 1969. 2 days later, Apollo 11 thundered off its launch pad toward the moon, and the world forgot the little submarine almost the moment it touched the water. A handful of quiet voices did try to warn the country. In 1966, as the rockets climbed and the moon race reached a fever pitch, the great American writer John Steinbeck sat by the sea and put pen to paper. He begged his country to give the ocean the same passion, the same attention, and the same fortune it was pouring into the stars. He wrote that he knew enough about the sea to understand how pitifully little we actually knew about it. He even predicted that long before humans ever fled to distant planets, we would turn back toward the oceans we had crawled out of. Nobody holding a checkbook was listening. Consider one comparison that says almost everything. The agency built to explore space was created in 1958. The first government office dedicated specifically to exploring the deep ocean was not created until the year 2001. That is a gap of more than 40 years. 40 years in which the sky had a powerful champion and the deep sea had very nearly no one. And the gap was not only measured in time, it was measured in dollars, and the difference is staggering. For decades, NASA's budget for exploration has run into the billions every single year. The small government office in charge of exploring the deep ocean has often had to make do with a few tens of millions. To put that in plain terms, for every dollar the nation aimed at the cosmos, the deep ocean received only pennies. When James Cameron made his famous descent to the bottom of the trench, the entire expedition cost somewhere around $8 million. That sounds like a fortune, until you remember that a single Hollywood blockbuster can spend more than that simply feeding its film crew. The deepest place on the planet was being explored on a budget smaller than a movie's lunch bill, and so the very wonder that had lifted our eyes toward the stars slowly drew them away from the sea beneath our feet. The cost of all that looking up is something we are only beginning to measure. Even today, after more than 60 years of progress, we have mapped only a little more than a quarter of our own seafloor in real detail, and believe it or not, that is the good news. Less than a decade ago, that number sat at just 6%. We have landed rovers on Mars. We have flown a spacecraft past Pluto 3 billion miles away and received crisp photographs in return. Yet the floor of our own ocean, the very thing holding up the water that gives us every other breath, remains mostly a blur. The old saying that we know more about the surface of the moon than the bottom of our seas is uncomfortably close to the truth. You would think that with a mystery that size sitting right beneath our boats, someone would have said something. For a very long time, hardly anyone did. But there is one story that ties this entire strange tale together, and it belongs to a woman named Catherine Sullivan. In 1984, Sullivan became the first American woman to walk in space. She did it during a mission aboard a space shuttle called Challenger. Hold on to that name. Because 36 years later, in 2020, Sullivan climbed into a submersible and traveled the other way entirely. She dropped almost 7 miles down to the deepest point in the ocean, a place called Challenger Deep. Two different worlds, and yet the very same name, and that is no accident. Both the space shuttle and the deepest spot in the sea were named after the very same thing, an old British research ship that sailed the globe back in the 1870s and first measured that impossible depth. Sullivan became the only person in history to have both walked in space and touched the bottom of the ocean. And when she returned to the surface from the deep, she did something perfect. She picked up a telephone and called the astronauts living on the space station passing overhead. Two crews, one floating far above the Earth and one just returned from far below it, comparing notes on the two last great frontiers. For one quiet moment, the sky and the sea were finally speaking to each other, and now for the hopeful part. After half a century of staring upward, we are finally beginning to look back down. A few years ago, a former naval officer and explorer named Victor Vescovo set out to reach the deepest point of every one of the world's 5 oceans, something no human had ever done. He succeeded. He has now visited the bottom of the Mariana Trench more times than anyone alive. Suddenly, after decades of silence, that lonely spot at the bottom of the world began receiving visitors again. Don Walsh's own son, Kelly, descended to the very seabed his father had reached 60 years earlier, quietly closing a circle that took 2 generations to complete. New submarines are being built. A global effort is now racing to finally map every last inch of the seafloor before the year 2030. Everything is finally in place for a true return to the deep. We just spent 50 long years learning how badly we needed it. So why did we really stop exploring the deep ocean? Not because it beat us. We had already proven back in 1960 that we could reach the very bottom and live to tell about it. We stopped because when an entire civilization was handed a choice between the stars above and the sea below, it chose to look up. The deepest place on our own planet became the thing we sailed straight over on our way to somewhere else. And maybe that is the strangest part of the whole story. For generations, we have stared out into space hoping to find life thriving in the dark, in the cold, in places with no sunlight at all. We have spent fortunes searching distant moons for exactly that kind of impossible life, and the entire time it was right there beneath us. 6 miles down in total darkness and crushing cold, entire worlds of living things have been thriving without the sun, on a planet we were certain we already understood. We did not run out of ocean to explore. We just looked the other way, and the deep is still down there, patient and dark and waiting, holding the answers to questions we are only now remembering to ask. If a story like this one stayed with you, subscribe and come back for the next one. There is so much more of this world left to uncover, and we are only just getting started.